Our guest panelist in this program is Daniel Dennett, Distinguished Art and Science Professor and Director of the Center for Cognitive Studies at Tufts University. Although his areas of specialization are cognitive science, philosophy of mind, and philosophy of psychology, he has published extensively on most philosophical topics. Professor Dennett has also brought his work to a wider public audience, most notably with The Mind's Eye, co-authored with Douglas Hofstadter, and his recent best-selling Consciousness Explained. The main objective in this panel discussion is to provide an overview of Professor Quine's major philosophical doctrines and to invite his comments on how he views these doctrines now. Very broadly, the areas we'll consider include his early association with logical positivism, his notorious skepticism about meaning, his stance on epistemology and ontology, and his characterization of philosophy as a part of or continuous with science. Finally, we discuss Quine's opinions of philosophy today and ask which problems he would choose to work on now if he were just beginning his philosophical career. We now join the panel on location in Cambridge, Massachusetts. Professor Quine, in our interview, we touched on a number of your philosophical doctrines and philosophical themes, which I'd like to pursue now in greater detail. To help us to do this, we're joined now by Daniel Dennett, Professor of Philosophy at Tufts University, Paul Horwich, Professor of Philosophy at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, and Martin Davies, who's wild reader of mental philosophy at Oxford University. Paul, could you start us off?
Yes, Professor Quine. I'd like to ask you about your sense of the philosophical scene at the beginning of your career, as you found it then. A common assumption about philosophy throughout its history is that it concerns a especially profound and important realm of facts of its own, having to do with the ultimate nature of reality and how we ought to lead our lives. These facts, it's often assumed, are completely distinct from scientific facts and are to be investigated by methods peculiar to philosophy, involving pure reason, speculative insight. But at the beginning of this century, the beginning of the 20th century, a movement was established known as positivism or logical empiricism that put into question this conception of philosophy. The positivists, such people as the young Ludwig Wittgenstein and Rudolf Carnap, held that what they called speculative metaphysics could give us nothing more than empty words, disguised nonsense, and that it should be done away with. Did you find yourself in sympathy with this critique of traditional philosophy?
I'm very much in sympathy with their attitude towards a good deal of speculative metaphysics. Where I would take issue is over the notion of there being a sharp boundary between that, on the one hand, and responsible science, natural science, on the other. I think of it rather as a matter of degree. The more speculative and general the problem or the doctrines are, perhaps the more philosophical. And you do, proceeding in that direction, reach a level finally where you can't make proper, responsible sense of the doctrines at all, and there you're in the realm where I very much sympathize with the logical positivists or empiricists in rejecting it as meaningless. As for questions of how one should live one's life, this sort of philosophy, if philosophy it be, is so very remote from science and from the kind of speculative philosophy that I find continuous with science, that I wouldn't know where to put it. It's a sort of, well, it's perhaps somewhat on a par with engineering, perhaps it's human engineering, in which one would draw on scientific findings insofar as they were relevant, including findings perhaps in psychology. And it's only an accidental matter of traditional usage, perhaps, to call it philosophical.
To go back to the first part of your answer to my question, the positivists thought that it was essential to get a strict separation between speculative metaphysics that they deplored and science that they liked. In saying, as you just did, that in your view there isn't a strict separation between metaphysics and science, aren't you departing in a fairly substantial way from the central tenet of...
Well, I'm certainly departing from them on that point. And, well, pretty substantial, I should think.
But that's not the only point at which you depart. You dedicated Word and Object in 1960 to Rudolf Carnap, teacher and friend, and the book begins, the first chapter, with just a clarion call to a different view of where we start in philosophy, to what Carnap had always proposed. And I'm wondering, were you able to persuade him that you were right in any of this? Which features of your vision, 25 years after, 30 years after you became a student, which features of your vision were you able to persuade him of, if any?
Back there in the period when I was, 1933 it was, when I was discussing so intensively with Carnap in Prague for some couple of months. At that time, he was between two books, his Logische Aufbau der Welt, which was decidedly based on a phenomenalistic approach, and Carnap had already departed from that orientation himself, and had just been writing, had just perhaps finished writing his logical syntax of language, which his wife was typing, and I was reading sheaf by sheaf as it came out of her typewriter. Certainly, my own attitude in Word and Object was decidedly remote from the Aufbau, but I felt not as remote from his current view at in the logical syntax. And my departures from his attitude in that book were more matters of well, largely matters of detail, but also, again, as in the case of the condemnation of metaphysics, question of my disavowing a demarcation in favor of gradations. And I felt early and late that my departures from Carnap's views as of logical syntax, from which incidentally he also departed very decidedly in the next few years in another direction from mine. But I felt that my departure from that intermediate stand in Carnap's development was a departure in the sense in which science progresses, not throwing over the old science as somehow having been wrong direction, but further improvements in the same general spirit. And I felt I was sharing Carnap's general spirit, the rigorous approach to philosophical questions, and liberal use of the techniques of mathematical logic. And that stays, and that to this day I think is a tremendous contribution on the part of, well, Vienna Circle, but more particularly Carnap.